Hey guys, tonight we wander into the quiet stone corridors of a medieval European monastery where the smell of freshly baked bread mingles with damp stone walls and the faint hum of monks chanting in the distance. You probably won't survive imagining the austere simplicity of these kitchens without a little shiver running down your spine. Think cold flagstones, wooden benches, and the endless rhythm of chopping, stirring, and kneading. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Go ahead, post your location and the local time. It's nice to know who's with you in spirit as we trudge through the medieval pantry. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge through the early morning, past cloisters slick with dew, and step into the heart of monastic life, the kitchen. The air is cool, but the scent of simmering grains, roasting herbs, and boiling legumes wraps around you like a warm blanket. Historians still argue whether these kitchens were purely functional or also served as spaces for silent reflection. But what you notice first is the order, the discipline, and the unspoken rhythm that guides every movement. Quirky tidbits emerge as your eyes adjust. Some manuscripts describe monks using whistles or small bells to coordinate tasks, like a medieval version of a kitchen timer or a subtle call and response system that would make even modern chefs blink in disbelief. You trudge past long wooden tables, noting the rough-hewn utensils, the large cauldrons bubbling over fires, and the occasional stray cat slinking in for a forbidden taste, which historians still debate as real presence or charming exaggeration. The monks themselves move like shadows, deliberate and precise. Some wear woolen habits stiff with centuries of tradition. Others bear aprons stained with the day's work. You probably won't survive imagining the combination of spiritual discipline and culinary labor without a gentle shiver. Here, every loaf of bread, every pot of pottage, every slice of preserved fruit carries both sustenance and devotion. Even the storage areas hold their own surprises. Barrels of grain, baskets of dried legumes, and jars of honey line the stone walls, preserved carefully from months of austerity. Historians still argue whether these stores were intended merely for survival or as a form of quiet abundance to ensure uninterrupted contemplation. Quirky accounts mention that monks sometimes used animals like mice to inspect grain for pests, a detail some scholars treat as factual observation and others as a humorous embellishment in monastic storytelling. You trudge along the stone floor, feeling the chill seep into your toes, and watch as novices learn the rhythm of chopping, stirring, and kneading, guided by experienced brothers whose hands move with the memory of decades. You probably won't survive imagining the quiet focus, the occasional whispered joke, or the clatter of iron utensils without a small smile at the balance between devotion and mundane labor. The rhythm is almost hypnotic. Fire crackles, water bubbles, and the subtle fragrance of herbs fills the air. Historians still debate how much of this work was solitary versus communal, how much was meant to nourish the body versus the soul. But for you, the sensory immersion is complete. You notice the little flower dust clouds dancing in the air, the glint of copper pots, and the slow, deliberate cadence of hands shaping bread, you probably won't survive imagining the almost meditative focus required to keep both hunger and spiritual longing in balance without a subtle tightening in your chest and a quiet appreciation for the centuries-old mastery at play. And so, your journey into monastic food begins not with a single recipe, but with the atmosphere itself, the chill of stone, the hum of devotion, the scent of simplicity, and the ever-present, almost sacred rhythm of preparation. You trudge forward with a sense of anticipation, knowing that each ingredient, each movement, and each taste has a story to tell. Some recorded in manuscripts, some whispered in tradition, and some existing only in the quiet memory of these ancient walls. Historians still argue whether the daily routine was a form of penance, meditation, or practical necessity, but the effect is immediate. You feel drawn into a world where food is never just food. It is ritual, discipline, and subtle artistry, all wrapped in the gentle hum of monastery life. You trudge past the morning light spilling through narrow windows, and your eyes are immediately drawn to the abundant yet austere presence of grains, the cornerstone of monastic sustenance. You probably won't survive imagining the endless sacks of wheat, barley, and rye stacked like miniature towers of patient labor without a quiet awe at the sheer scale of preparation required. Historians still debate whether monks cultivated multiple varieties for practicality, taste, or symbolic reasons. But the fact is that grains formed the foundation of nearly every meal, from the simplest porridge to the hearty loaves that lined the refectory tables. Quirky details emerge. Some accounts suggest that monks would inscribe blessings or prayers onto bread dough before baking, a practice historians still argue as either deeply spiritual or merely a superstitious tradition to ward off bad luck. You trudge alongside novices as they knead dough on wide, flour-dusted boards, the scent of yeast tangling with the faint smokiness of the hearth fire. The texture of the flour clings to your fingertips, rough and persistent, a tactile reminder that in the monastery, even the simplest labor carries quiet significance. Porridge, often made from coarse barley or oats, simmers slowly over low fires. You probably won't survive imagining the thick, almost unrecognizable mush being stirred for hours without a hint of grimace or a tiny chuckle at medieval taste buds versus modern expectations. Historians still argue whether monks consumed porridge primarily for sustenance or as a form of humble self-discipline, an exercise in restraint and patience. Some manuscripts even describe porridge being sweetened with small amounts of honey or dried fruit, which would have felt like a rare treat against the monotony of the grain-heavy diet. Bread, meanwhile, dominates the monastic table. Large, dense loaves, sometimes made with coarse whole grains, provide not just nourishment, but also a sense of order and rhythm. Measure, knead, rest, bake, repeat. Quirky stories persist about monks marking loaves with initials or symbols to indicate which brother baked them, a detail historians still debate as either a practical labeling system or a form of subtle personal pride. You trudge past long shelves lined with these loaves, their crusts hard and golden, the air around them tinged with warmth and the faint aroma of yeast. The communal aspect of baking reinforces discipline and hierarchy. Novices learn under the watchful eyes of experienced brothers, their hands copying the precise motions that have been repeated for decades, if not centuries. You probably won't survive picturing the quiet camaraderie and the occasional whispered joke across the flour-dusted boards without a soft smile at the blend of levity and devotion. Historians still argue how much of this process was about efficiency versus spiritual exercise, but the effect is clear: labor and faith entwined, shaping both body and mind. And yet, not every grain was mundane. Some monasteries experimented with barley, rye, or spelt mixtures, often depending on local harvests and soil quality. Quirky references suggest that monks occasionally tried experimental breads, incorporating herbs or even bits of dried fruit, a detail historians still debate as culinary innovation or occasional indulgence. You trudge past these shelves, noticing the variation in color, texture, and aroma, each loaf a testament to patience, skill, and an unspoken reverence for sustenance. So, as you follow the rhythm of kneading, stirring, and baking, you begin to understand the monastery's philosophy. Simplicity is not deprivation, but a canvas for discipline, reflection, and subtle creativity. Grains are never just grains here. They are the backbone of survival, the instruments of devotion, and the medium through which centuries of culinary and spiritual tradition converge. You probably won't survive imagining the centuries of practice embedded in every crust without a quiet awe, a soft recognition that in these simple, humble foods, there is a profound intersection of life, faith, and human ingenuity. You trudge through the monastery garden, and the earthy scent of soil mixed with early morning dew fills your senses. You probably won't survive imagining the meticulous rows of vegetables stretching before you, the neat beds of cabbage, leeks, onions, and garlic, the occasional herbs tucked between plants, without a quiet admiration for the monk's devotion to both cultivation and sustenance. Historians still debate whether monastic gardens were primarily functional or also served as contemplative spaces, places where tending plants nurtured the spirit as well as the body. Quirky tidbits emerge as you wander along the garden paths. Some manuscripts suggest monks would plant vegetables according to the phases of the moon, a practice historians still argue as either genuine agricultural wisdom or symbolic superstition. You trudge slowly, noticing the way the morning sun glints off dew on broad cabbage leaves, how the soil clings stubbornly to your shoes, and the quiet symmetry of rows that seem almost ritualistic in their precision. Vegetables form the backbone of the monastic diet, providing essential nutrients in an age before scientific nutrition. You probably won't survive imagining the monks harvesting root vegetables with bare hands, feeling the soil crumble between their fingers, and carefully selecting the best for soups, pottages, and stews, without a subtle sense of connection to centuries of practice. Historians still argue how diverse these gardens truly were. Some accounts suggest exotic herbs like sage or thyme were rare luxuries, while others claim they were surprisingly common, cultivated with the same devotion as staple crops. Leeks, onions, and garlic were indispensable, not just for flavor, but for perceived medicinal properties. Quirky sources describe monks chewing garlic to ward off spirits, or to bolster courage before fasting rituals, a detail historians debate as symbolic exaggeration versus actual practice. You trudge past the raised beds, noting the small bundles of herbs drying in the sun, the subtle scent of rosemary carried by a gentle breeze, and the quiet efficiency of monastic agricultural systems designed to sustain life with minimal waste. Seasonal vegetables dictated meals as much as spiritual calendars did. In winter, preserved cabbages and root vegetables substituted for fresh greens, while spring brought a burst of leafy vegetables to awaken both body and palate. You probably won't survive imagining the subtle joy in a simple fresh leaf of lettuce after months of dried roots without a small smile at the enduring human pleasure in freshness and texture. Historians still argue whether seasonal variety was strictly followed or occasionally bent for indulgence, but the rhythm of the garden clearly shaped the monastery's culinary cycle. Monks often experimented with companion planting onions next to carrots or herbs beside cabbage to enhance growth or repel pests. Quirky manuscripts suggest that some monks spoke to their vegetables, a practice historians still debate as either sincere ritual or playful folklore. You trudge along, brushing past the tips of tall, swaying herbs, imagining the quiet murmurs of the brothers as they work, their hands moving in practiced, almost meditative motions, blending labor with reflection. By the time you leave the garden, your senses are steeped in its textures, smells, and subtle lessons. Vegetables in the monastery are more than food. They are a product of patience, observation, and devotion. You probably won't survive imagining the intricate dance of soil, sun, and human care without a quiet reverence for the simple yet profound cycle of planting, tending, and harvesting that has sustained countless generations. In these humble beds, discipline meets creativity, nourishment meets ritual, and the quiet rhythm of daily life unfolds with deliberate, calming precision. You trudge to the storage area where baskets of legumes, beans, lentils, and peas sit patiently, waiting to fulfill their role as the monastery's primary protein source. You probably won't survive imagining the sheer monotony of these humble pulses day after day without a quiet appreciation for the monk's discipline in turning such simple ingredients into sustaining meals. Historians still debate whether legumes were considered merely practical or whether they held symbolic significance as foods of humility and spiritual fortitude. Quirky details emerge as you sort through the baskets. Some accounts suggest monks used legumes to predict certain weather patterns or harvest outcomes, tossing a handful into boiling water to see how they reacted. A practice historians still argue as either superstition or early agricultural experimentation. You trudge past rows of dried peas and lentils, feeling the weight of history in every sack, noticing the subtle variations in size and color, and imagining centuries of hands sorting, rinsing, and cooking these modest treasures. Legumes were indispensable during fasting periods when meat was forbidden. You probably won't survive imagining the rhythmic stirring of thick lentil stews, the soft pop of beans cooking to tender perfection, and the occasional clink of iron spoons without a gentle grin at the ingenuity required to transform such basic ingredients into satisfying meals. Historians still debate which types of legumes were most common. Some suggest chickpeas and broad beans were staples, while others argue that regional variation created a much wider variety. Preparation was both practical and ritualized. Soaking, boiling, and seasoning with available herbs required patience and precision. Quirky manuscripts hint at monks marking the best legumes for communal meals with tiny symbols, a detail historians still question as practical notation or subtle pride in craftsmanship. You trudge alongside novices as they learn the precise timing and technique needed to avoid mushy disasters or undercooked beans, imagining the quiet satisfaction of mastering such humble culinary skills. Legumes also carried medicinal and symbolic associations. Some monks believed lentils could restore strength after long vigils or penance, while beans were occasionally linked to spiritual reflection and humility. You probably won't survive imagining these dual roles as nourishment and as symbols of restraint, without a subtle smile at the intertwining of practical and spiritual life. Historians still argue whether such beliefs were widespread or anecdotal, but the presence of these foods in every monastery is undeniable. Even the smallest details mattered. Soaking water was often saved to water the garden, and leftover legumes could be ground into flour or added to pottages. Quirky references suggest that some monks kept meticulous legume diaries, recording the quality of the harvest and cooking results, a practice historians debate as real or exaggerated. You trudge past these quiet storages, noticing the careful labeling, the subtle fragrance of dried pulses, and the order imposed upon what might otherwise seem mundane. By the time you leave the legume storage, you understand their understated power. They are modest, unassuming, yet vital, an exercise in patience, precision, and quiet creativity. You probably won't survive imagining the centuries of practice embedded in the daily boiling of lentils without a gentle reverence for how something so simple can sustain life, enforce discipline, and provide quiet comfort to generations of monks who relied on them to bridge both hunger and spiritual focus. In these humble legumes, sustenance meets ritual, and simplicity becomes a testament to human ingenuity and devotion. You trudge toward the monastery orchard, where apple, pear, and plum trees stretch their limbs toward the sky, leaves shimmering in the morning light. You probably won't survive imagining the delicate balance of seasons, soil, and sunlight required to yield fruit without a quiet admiration for the monk's patient cultivation over years, sometimes decades. Historians still debate whether orchards were primarily utilitarian, or if they were also contemplative spaces designed to encourage reflection and gratitude while tending to the trees. Quirky details emerge as you wander beneath the branches. Some manuscripts suggest that monks would whisper blessings to each tree or leave small offerings of bread at the base of trunks, a practice historians still argue as either ritual devotion or charming superstition. You trudge slowly among the trees, noticing the smooth bark of young apple saplings and the gnarled limbs of older trees, imagining the rhythm of pruning, grafting, and harvesting that filled countless mornings with quiet, purposeful labor. Fruit was eaten fresh, dried, or pressed into juices and ciders. You probably won't survive imagining the tedious process of drying plums over straw mats for winter stores without a subtle grin at the ingenuity of medieval preservation. Historians still argue which fruits were considered staples versus rare treats. Some records emphasize apples and pears, while others highlight the occasional quince or medlar, whose flavors now seem almost exotic to modern palates. Harvesting required careful timing. Pick too early and the fruit is sour. Pick too late and it rots. Quirky anecdotes note that some monks would test ripeness by tossing fruit lightly to see if it answered, a practice historians debate as playful folklore or practical observation. You trudge past baskets filling quickly with ripe apples, the scent of autumn sweetness mingling with earthy soil, while novices learn the subtle art of selecting fruit at just the right moment, guided by the experienced hands of elder brothers. Preservation was as creative as cultivation. Monks boiled fruits into compotes, dried them for storage, or fermented them into light ciders for nutrition during fasts. You probably won't survive imagining the rhythmic chopping of apples and stirring of bubbling compotes without a soft chuckle at the centuries-old recipes that were as much about ingenuity as they were about flavor. Historians still debate how widespread fermentation practices were, whether every monastery had a small cidery or whether it was a rare indulgence reserved for select communities. Orchard maintenance also involved careful observation of pests and weather. Quirky accounts describe monks using natural repellents like crushed herbs or even smoke to protect the fruit, a detail historians still argue as either accurate or exaggeration. You trudge along the orchard paths, feeling the crunch of fallen leaves beneath your feet, noticing how each tree has its place and purpose, every branch tended with patience, foresight, and subtle devotion. By the time you leave the orchard, the lesson is clear. Fruit in a monastery is never trivial. Each apple or pear represents patience, observation, and a mindful connection to nature. You probably won't survive imagining the centuries of careful cultivation, pruning, and harvest without a quiet reverence for the balance of labor and reflection. In these simple fruits, nourishment, ritual, and subtle creativity converge, teaching that even the smallest acts of care can yield lasting sustenance and quiet joy. You trudge down the narrow stone corridors toward the monastery's dairy, where the faint, creamy aroma of fresh milk greets you. You probably won't survive imagining the daily rhythm required to tend to cows, goats, or sheep without a quiet respect for the monk's relentless devotion to both animal care and sustenance. Historians still debate how common monastic dairies were across Europe, with some arguing that only wealthier monasteries maintained livestock, while others suggest even modest communities found ways to cultivate milk and cheese for daily nourishment. Quirky details appear as you approach the stalls. Some manuscripts suggest monks spoke softly to their animals, claiming that calmer cows produced richer milk, a practice historians still debate as either practical husbandry or charming superstition. You trudge alongside the milking benches, noticing the soft sway of tails, the gentle nuzzle of curious animals, and the rhythmic motion of wooden buckets as milk is drawn with patient, practiced hands. Milk was consumed fresh, but it also underwent transformation into butter, cheese, and cream. You probably won't survive imagining the slow, careful churning of butter over hours without a faint smile at the ingenuity of these simple preservation methods. Historians still argue whether certain types of cheese, like hard-aged varieties, were common in early medieval monasteries, or if soft, fresh cheeses predominated. Some recipes suggest that even herbs or spices were occasionally mixed into cheeses, a quirky practice that added subtle flavor, though historians debate how widespread this culinary creativity truly was. The process demanded discipline. Milking had to be done at set times, animals had to be fed, and the products stored carefully in cool cellars to prevent spoilage. You trudge past racks of newly pressed cheeses, the earthy aroma mingling with the faint scent of hay and livestock, imagining the satisfaction of transforming liquid milk into firm, lasting nourishment. Quirky anecdotes describe monks shaping cheese into symbolic forms, sometimes imprinted with crosses or initials, a detail historians still argue as either devotional expression or playful personalization. Dairy also played a key role during fasting periods. Milk, butter, and cheese provided essential calories and protein when meat was prohibited, reinforcing the rhythm of spiritual and dietary discipline. You probably won't survive picturing the quiet contentment of monks savoring a small piece of aged cheese after a long day without a subtle appreciation for the simple joys of medieval life. Historians still debate whether all monasteries had access to sufficient dairy, or if some relied heavily on legumes and grains alone. Even the byproducts were utilized. Whey could be given to pigs or used in baking bread, ensuring nothing went to waste. Quirky references suggest that some monks experimented with fermented milk drinks, a detail historians still argue as experimental nutrition or anecdotal embellishment. You trudge through the dairy, the wooden beams above creaking softly, and the occasional lowing or bleating of animals punctuating the quiet, deliberate rhythm of work. By the time you leave the dairy, you begin to understand that these simple foods are more than nourishment. They are a bridge between labor, ingenuity, and spiritual routine. You probably won't survive imagining centuries of careful milking, churning, and cheese making without a quiet awe for the interplay of discipline and creativity. In every jug of milk or wheel of cheese, the monk's devotion, patience, and subtle innovation shine, turning humble sustenance into a quiet testament to human ingenuity and faith. You trudge toward the monastery kitchen, where the scent of freshly baked bread mingles with the faint hint of smoke from the hearth. You probably won't survive imagining the daily rhythm required to knead, shape, and bake loaves that would feed dozens without a quiet admiration for the patience and precision of monastic bakers. Historians still debate whether bread was primarily a staple for sustenance, or if its preparation also held symbolic significance in ritual and communal life. Quirky details emerge as you watch the bakers at work. Some manuscripts describe monks marking the tops of loaves with crosses or simple patterns, claiming that it blessed the bread, a practice historians still argue as either spiritual devotion or playful creativity. You trudge past long wooden tables dusted with flour, noticing the gentle puffing of dough as yeast works its quiet magic, imagining the countless hours of kneading and waiting that transform a simple mixture of flour and water into nourishing bread. Bread was the cornerstone of monastic diets. You probably won't survive imagining the variety, from coarse, dark rye meant to sustain the body during long fasts to lighter wheat loaves reserved for feast days, without a subtle appreciation for the resourcefulness required to make do with what was locally available. Historians still debate which grains were most common in different regions. Some argue that barley and oats were staples, while wheat remained a prized, less accessible commodity. Preparation was meticulous. Yeast had to be cultivated carefully, water measured precisely, and ovens maintained at consistent temperatures. Quirky anecdotes suggest that some monks whispered to the dough to encourage rising, a detail historians still debate as either folkloric whimsy or genuine tradition. You trudge alongside novices, learning the exact timing of kneading and baking, the flour coating their hands, and the warmth of the oven radiating gently against their arms. Bread also had a symbolic dimension. The act of breaking and sharing it reinforced communal bonds and spiritual mindfulness. You probably won't survive imagining the quiet reverence with which a loaf was divided among brothers, the ritualized gestures linking sustenance and spiritual reflection, without a faint smile at the continuity of human connection through food. Historians still argue how deeply these rituals permeated daily life. Some suggest it was a ubiquitous practice, while others imply it was more ceremonial than routine. Even scraps were valued. Crusts could be toasted for soups or ground into breadcrumbs, leaving nothing to waste. Quirky accounts note that leftover dough was sometimes given to children or animals, a detail historians still argue as either practical thrift or anecdotal charm. You trudge past racks of baked loaves cooling gently on straw mats, the air fragrant and warm, imagining centuries of monastic hands performing the same careful, reverent work. By the time you leave the kitchen, you realize that bread is more than a simple food. You probably won't survive imagining the centuries of careful baking, ritual, and resourcefulness without a quiet reverence for the way such a humble staple could sustain body, spirit, and community alike. In every loaf, patience, creativity, and devotion converge, reminding you that even the simplest foods are imbued with history, ingenuity, and quiet care. You trudge toward the monastery herb garden, where the air is thick with the fragrance of rosemary, sage, thyme, and a dozen other green treasures. You probably won't survive imagining the meticulous care required to cultivate these tiny plants without a quiet appreciation for the monk's keen observation of seasons, soil, and subtle environmental cues. Historians still debate whether herbs were grown primarily for culinary purposes, medicinal use, or a combination of both, as records often intertwine practical advice with spiritual notes. Quirky details abound. Some manuscripts claim that monks would talk to their herbs or even play soft music, believing it improved growth, a practice historians still argue as either superstition or early horticultural psychology. You trudge along the narrow dirt paths, feeling the delicate brush of leaves against your fingers and inhaling the mix of scents, imagining the rhythm of planting, weeding, and harvesting that filled countless quiet mornings with purpose and mindfulness. Herbs were essential for flavoring the otherwise simple monastic diet. You probably won't survive imagining the gentle chopping of sage into stews or sprinkling thyme over boiled vegetables without a subtle grin at the ingenuity needed to enhance modest meals. Historians still debate which herbs were most prevalent. Some argue that parsley and marjoram dominated, while others suggest more exotic additions like borage or lovage were prized in certain regions. Preparation was deliberate. Leaves were dried, stems saved for teas, and roots carefully preserved for medicinal use. Quirky anecdotes hint at monks crafting little sachets of dried herbs, placing them in closets and cells to ward off bad smells, or perhaps just to enjoy a subtle perfume, details historians still argue as practical or whimsical. You trudge past bundles of drying herbs hanging from rafters, the air scented with warmth and earthiness, imagining the patient hands that plucked, tied, and stored each sprig. Herbs were also medicinal. You probably won't survive picturing the careful brewing of teas for digestion, minor ailments, or strengthening the body without appreciating how observation, experience, and empirical knowledge merged with monastic spirituality. Historians still debate whether herbal remedies were systematically studied or learned through oral tradition. But the continuity of these practices suggests their effectiveness, or at least the monks' commitment to care. Even the tiniest detail mattered. Some leaves were ground into powders for poultices, others infused into oils, while seeds might be stored for next season. Quirky accounts describe experiments with mixing multiple herbs, a practice historians argue as either genuine innovation or playful experimentation. You trudge through the neat rows, the sunlight catching on dew-laden leaves, and feel the rhythm of centuries of careful cultivation and observation. By the time you leave the herb garden, you realize these plants represent more than flavor or medicine. They embody patience, observation, and a subtle artistry of care. You probably won't survive imagining the centuries of thoughtful tending, harvesting, and preparation without a quiet awe for the monk's ability to create life, health, and aroma from the humblest of plants. In these herbs, utility, ritual, and creativity converge into a quiet, sustaining alchemy. You trudge toward the monastery fish ponds, where water ripples gently under the early morning sun, and the occasional splash betrays the presence of carp, trout, and other freshwater fish. You probably won't survive imagining the patient attention required to manage these ponds without appreciating the monks' intricate knowledge of water, seasons, and feeding cycles. Historians still debate whether monastic fish farming was widespread across Europe or mostly confined to wealthier or strategically located monasteries near rivers and springs. Quirky details emerge as you observe the water. Some records suggest that monks whispered to the fish or tapped gently on the water's surface to guide feeding, a practice historians still argue as either genuine husbandry technique or charming folklore. You trudge along the pond edges, noticing reeds swaying in the breeze and the glimmer of scales beneath the surface, imagining the daily routine of checking water levels, removing debris, and maintaining ponds for optimal health and productivity. Fish were critical, especially during fasting periods. You probably won't survive picturing the careful timing of netting and preparing fish for meals without a soft smile at the subtle artistry required to sustain a population while ensuring a continuous food supply. Historians still debate which species were most commonly stocked. Some suggest carp was ubiquitous, while others argue for a wider variety, including pike or tench, depending on local conditions. Maintenance demanded discipline. Ponds had to be monitored for predators, algae growth, and water quality. Quirky anecdotes tell of monks using small wooden boats to feed the fish or even attempting to train them to eat from their hands, a detail historians still argue as either playful experimentation or accurate observation. You trudge past nets, baskets, and simple wooden sluices, imagining the rhythm of daily care, the careful counting, and the quiet patience required to ensure a reliable yield. Fish also featured in preservation techniques. You probably won't survive imagining the slow salting, smoking, or drying of fish to store them for winter without appreciating the ingenuity and discipline required to prevent spoilage. Historians still debate how long fish could be stored safely and whether these techniques were standardized across monastic communities or improvised according to local knowledge. Even the pond ecosystem mattered. Ducks, insects, and water plants all played subtle roles in maintaining balance. Quirky accounts mention monks observing the behavior of dragonflies or frogs as indicators of water health, a practice historians still argue as either practical ecological observation or anecdotal charm. You trudge along the banks, the soft croak of a frog and the distant ripple of fish forming a serene soundtrack to the careful, centuries-old practice of aquatic husbandry. By the time you leave the ponds, it's clear that fish in a monastery represent more than nourishment. They embody observation, patience, and subtle innovation. You probably won't survive imagining the centuries of attentive care, feeding, and preservation without a quiet awe for the monk's capacity to balance practicality and ritual, ecology and sustenance. In every ripple and scale, discipline and creativity converge, turning simple fish into a sustaining treasure of medieval life. You trudge toward the monastery's orchard, where the air carries the subtle perfume of ripening apples, pears, and plums, mingling with the earthy scent of fallen leaves. You probably won't survive imagining the delicate balance required to maintain fruit trees without appreciating the monk's understanding of pruning, grafting, and seasonal rhythms. Historians still debate whether orchard cultivation was primarily practical for sustenance or also symbolic, representing cycles of life and spiritual growth within monastic philosophy. Quirky details greet you as you step beneath the low branches. Some manuscripts suggest monks would talk to the trees or even play soft music, believing it encouraged fruit production, a practice historians still argue as either superstition or early horticultural psychology. You trudge along the rows, noticing the variation in color and texture of leaves and fruit, the occasional rogue squirrel or bird scavenging, and the rhythmic sound of wind through branches, imagining the careful hands harvesting, thinning, and maintaining trees to ensure a bountiful yield year after year. Fruits were eaten fresh, dried, or preserved. You probably won't survive picturing the slow, deliberate process of peeling, slicing, and drying apples for winter stores without a faint smile at the ingenuity required to sustain a community through the lean months. Historians still debate which preservation methods were most common. Some argue for sun-drying, others for smoking or fermenting, with evidence varying regionally. Maintenance demanded discipline and foresight. Branches had to be pruned at precise times, grafting performed to improve yield, and pests controlled with natural remedies. Quirky anecdotes tell of monks using nets or simple scarecrows to protect fruit from birds and animals, a detail historians still argue as either common practice or isolated ingenuity. You trudge past baskets full of bright red apples, their skins glistening in the soft sunlight, imagining the repetitive but meditative rhythm of harvest that connected human hands to the land's bounty. Fruit also featured in culinary experimentation. You probably won't survive imagining the crafting of preserves, compotes, and simple tarts with limited sugar without appreciating the subtle creativity required to make monotony into delight. Historians still debate whether monasteries were more innovative than common households in culinary use, but surviving recipes suggest careful experimentation with flavors and textures. Even fallen fruit had value. Some was composted, some fed to livestock, and occasionally fermenting fruits were used to make cider or vinegar. Quirky references suggest that monks occasionally held taste tests of different varieties, a detail historians still argue as either genuine evaluation or charming anecdote. You trudge through the orchard paths, the crunch of leaves beneath your feet, and the scent of fruit mingling in a soft symphony, appreciating the quiet labor and patience that transform trees into nourishment. By the time you leave the orchard, you understand that fruit in a monastery represents more than sustenance. It embodies observation, patience, and the art of subtle innovation. You probably won't survive imagining centuries of grafting, harvesting, and preserving without a quiet admiration for the monk's capacity to cultivate beauty and sustenance from simple trees. In every crisp apple or sweet plum, discipline, creativity, and connection to nature converge. You trudge toward the monastery cellar, descending a narrow stone staircase that smells faintly of earth, wine, and time itself. You probably won't survive imagining the centuries of careful storage practices that monks perfected without appreciating their uncanny ability to control temperature, humidity, and pests in spaces that are largely hidden from view. Historians still debate whether cellaring techniques were standardized or improvised based on each monastery's unique architecture and local climate. Quirky details emerge as you run a hand along cool, damp stone walls. Some manuscripts suggest that monks would tap barrels of wine or beer and listen to the reverberations to determine readiness, a practice historians still argue as either a genuine diagnostic tool or anecdotal lore. You trudge past stacks of wooden casks, clay amphorae, and woven baskets holding preserved fruits and root vegetables, imagining the quiet rituals of checking, rotating, and sampling stored food to ensure it would last through the winter months. Preservation was essential. You probably won't survive picturing the careful salting of meats, drying of herbs, and and fermenting of grains without a subtle nod to the monks' ingenuity in turning simple foods into long-lasting sustenance. Historians still debate whether fermenting practices were primarily nutritional, medicinal, or a combination, as records often blur culinary innovation with monastic self-sufficiency. Even liquids demanded attention. Wine, beer, and cider were stored with precision. Quirky anecdotes describe monks whispering blessings over barrels, claiming it improved taste, a detail historians still argue as either spiritual ritual or fanciful folklore. You trudge along the narrow aisles, inhaling the musty, earthy aroma and imagining the patience required to age and monitor each batch, occasionally testing with careful taste to maintain quality and prevent spoilage. Roots, grains, and legumes filled the cellar's shelves. You probably won't survive picturing the meticulous organization required to keep everything accessible, rotated, and safe from vermin without appreciating the monk's discipline in maintaining both order and abundance. Historians still debate how standardized these storage systems were across monasteries, with some suggesting elaborate shelving and others simple stacking dictated by space and necessity. Even the mundane was approached with creativity. Quirky references hint that monks experimented with layering produce to optimize airflow or combining fermented liquids for flavor variations, a practice historians still argue as either innovative experimentation or anecdotal curiosity. You trudge past barrels lined with straw, sacks of beans, and carefully packed root vegetables, imagining the quiet diligence and continuity of centuries of food preservation practices that were essential to survival. By the time you leave the cellar, it's clear that these dark, cool spaces represent more than storage. They embody foresight, patience, and innovation. You probably won't survive imagining centuries of careful monitoring, tasting, and organizing without a quiet awe for the monk's ability to transform simple food into enduring sustenance. In every cask, sack, and bundle, discipline, observation, and subtle creativity converge. You trudge toward the monastery kitchen, where the warm, slightly smoky aroma of simmering stews, fresh bread, and roasting vegetables greets you like an old friend. You probably won't survive imagining the orchestration required to feed an entire monastic community, using primarily simple, local ingredients without a deep appreciation for the rhythm, timing, and foresight baked into every meal. Historians still debate whether monastic cuisine prioritized nutrition, ritual compliance, or subtle culinary delight, as evidence often intertwines practicality with pious intention. Quirky details peek out from historical records. Some manuscripts claim that monks maintained a strict rotation of pots, taste testing stews for consistency, or even chatting quietly with ingredients to encourage flavor, a practice historians still argue as either anecdotal charm or early mindful cooking. You trudge along the worn stone floors, the heat radiating from the hearth warming your face, imagining the precise choreography of boiling, simmering, baking, and stirring to prepare meals that were modest yet sustaining. Bread was central. You probably won't survive picturing the long hours spent kneading dough, feeding sourdough starters, and managing stone ovens without a smile at the humble artistry in turning flour and water into sustenance. Historians still debate whether bread varieties differed significantly between monasteries or followed a mostly uniform approach, but surviving recipes suggest subtle experimentation with grains, hydration, and baking times. Soups and stews demanded careful layering of flavors from roots, legumes, and herbs. Quirky anecdotes describe monks tasting pots with wooden spoons, adjusting seasoning with patience, and occasionally exchanging culinary tips through coded shorthand in manuscripts, a detail historians still argue as either practical or whimsical. You trudge past steaming cauldrons, imagining the quiet hum of daily kitchen life, the interplay of scent, texture, and temperature harmonized by centuries of experience. Even the simplest ingredients were treated with care. You probably won't survive picturing monks scraping every scrap from pots, preserving peels, and transforming leftovers into nourishing additions for subsequent meals without appreciating the ingenuity and economy embedded in monastic routines. Historians still debate whether these practices were purely necessity-driven or cultivated as moral discipline intertwined with spiritual practice. Fasting and feast days added another layer. Quirky records suggest that during strict fasts, monks experimented with spices, vinegar, and herbs to make plain meals more palatable, a detail historians still argue as either gastronomic creativity or ritual embellishment. You trudge among wooden tables, benches, and the faint echoes of past meals, sensing the quiet dedication and continuity that transformed simple ingredients into communal sustenance and subtle sensory delight. By the time you leave the kitchen, it's evident that monastic cooking represents more than nutrition. It embodies mindfulness, discipline, and creativity within constraints. You probably won't survive imagining the careful choreography of centuries of meals without a quiet admiration for the monk's capacity to infuse simplicity with thoughtful artistry. In every pot, loaf, and ladle, patience, observation, and devotion converge seamlessly. You trudge toward the monastery garden beds, where the cool morning dew clings to rows of leafy greens, herbs, and tiny root vegetables, glistening in the gentle sunlight. You probably won't survive imagining the painstaking care required to grow such simple foods in sometimes unforgiving medieval climates without a profound respect for the monk's patience, observation, and seasonal wisdom. Historians still debate whether gardens were designed primarily for sustenance, medicinal purposes, or as contemplative spaces blending utility and spirituality. Quirky details surface as you brush your fingers over thyme, sage, and marjoram. Some records hint that monks would hum or recite prayers while planting seeds, believing that rhythm and intention encouraged growth, a practice historians still argue as either symbolic ritual or early agricultural psychology. You trudge between narrow soil paths, noticing the variations in soil texture, the occasional insect, and the subtle scent of damp earth mingling with herbs, imagining the hours spent weeding, watering, and rotating crops to maximize yield. Vegetables were harvested carefully. You probably won't survive picturing the precise timing required to pick lettuces, leeks, and carrots at peak ripeness without appreciating the knowledge embedded in these simple decisions, passed down through generations. Historians still debate which varieties were most common, as the historical record mixes local traditions with broader European influences. Even composting demanded discipline. Quirky anecdotes describe monks using decomposed leaves, kitchen scraps, and animal manure to enrich beds, occasionally labeling patches with charming symbols or names, a detail historians still argue as either practical organization or playful superstition. You trudge past rows of cabbages, onions, and spinach, imagining the careful layering, soil turning, and compost mixing that maintained fertility while fostering ecological balance. Herbs, too, had dual purposes. You probably won't survive imagining the simultaneous cultivation for culinary and medicinal use without appreciating the nuanced understanding of plant properties and flavors that monks held. Historians still debate how systematically medicinal herbs were integrated versus grown opportunistically, but surviving texts suggest sophisticated knowledge of herbal remedies alongside everyday cooking. Even water management was subtle. Quirky accounts suggest monks used small channels, clay pots, or simple rainwater catchment systems to irrigate specific plots, a practice historians still argue as either ingenious adaptation or anecdotal embellishment. You trudge along damp pathways, listening to the faint trickle of water, sensing the rhythm of seasons, and the quiet attention that kept these gardens productive and serene. By the time you leave the garden, it's clear that simple plants represent more than nourishment. They embody observation, patience, and harmony with natural cycles. You probably won't survive imagining centuries of planting, tending, and harvesting without a quiet admiration for the monk's ability to cultivate life from earth with care and reverence. In every leaf, root, and sprig of herb, discipline, creativity, and mindfulness converge effortlessly. You trudge toward the monastery refectory, where long wooden tables gleam faintly under soft candlelight, and the aroma of the day's meals still lingers in the air. You probably won't survive imagining the careful orchestration required to serve simple foods to dozens of monks while maintaining order, ritual, and silence. Historians still debate whether the structure of monastic meals, timed, quiet, and precise, was primarily spiritual discipline, practical efficiency, or both intertwined seamlessly. Quirky details peek through the records. Some suggest that monks used subtle hand signals or taps on the table to coordinate meal service, a practice historians still argue as either practical communication or charming anecdote. You trudge along the benches, feeling the weight of centuries of shared meals, imagining the monotony and meditation intertwined. Each sip of broth, bite of bread, or serving of pottage executed with mindfulness. Silence was sacred but not absolute. You probably won't survive picturing the occasional whispered readings or quiet reflections during meals without appreciating the rhythm of contemplation woven into every morsel. Historians still debate the extent to which communal eating reinforced obedience versus fostering subtle social bonds among monks. Even utensils carried subtle significance. Quirky anecdotes mention that wooden spoons or ceramic bowls were sometimes marked to indicate portions or ownership, a detail historians still argue as either strict regulation or playful ritual. You trudge past plates, cups, and trays, noting the careful placement and rotation, imagining the precision and attentiveness required to prevent waste while nourishing the body and spirit simultaneously. Meal structure demanded careful timing. You probably won't survive imagining the coordination of kitchen, pantry, and cellar to ensure that each dish reached the refectory warm and ready without appreciating the logistical mastery this simple sustenance required. Historians still debate whether feasts on holy days were extravagant exceptions or carefully measured extensions of everyday discipline. Even food presentation mattered subtly. Quirky references describe arranging vegetables and bread neatly to encourage gratitude and mindfulness, a practice historians still argue as either aesthetic preference or moral teaching. You trudge along the benches, the echo of wooden chairs, the soft clink of utensils, and the faint, lingering smells of stews forming a gentle symphony, emphasizing the quiet reverence embedded in each communal meal. By the time you leave the refectory, it's clear that monastic meals represent more than sustenance. They embody ritual, mindfulness, and discipline. You probably won't survive imagining centuries of coordinated eating, preparation, and silent reflection without a quiet admiration for the monk's ability to transform simple food into a sustained, contemplative practice. Every bite, sip, and gesture converges into a ritual of subtle, disciplined nourishment. You trudge toward the monastery courtyard, where the final glimpses of sunlight stretch across stone walls, and the scent of dried herbs, baked bread, and the lingering tang of cider mingle in the cool evening air. You probably won't survive imagining how the monks balanced simplicity, discipline, and nourishment over centuries without pausing to appreciate their extraordinary ingenuity. Historians still debate whether the overall monastic food system was primarily practical, spiritual, or a deliberate fusion of both that created a self-sustaining rhythm for life. Quirky details emerge as you take in the worn pathways and scattered remnants of kitchen tools. Some records suggest monks would taste herbs in the courtyard before planting them indoors or outdoors, believing in a testing by touch method that historians still argue as either a literal horticultural practice or anecdotal embellishment. You trudge along, noticing the interplay of light and shadow across vegetable beds, orchards, and stone terraces, imagining the daily flow of activity, from early morning bread baking to the late afternoon tending of roots and leafy greens, all coordinated with quiet, disciplined precision. Preservation and preparation intertwined seamlessly. You probably won't survive picturing the monks storing fruits and vegetables in cellars, drying herbs, and fermenting liquids while also cultivating medicinal plants without a quiet admiration for the layered, systematic approach to life and sustenance. Historians still debate whether such practices were local adaptations or widespread across European monastic traditions. Even communal habits bore subtle instruction. Quirky anecdotes describe monks chanting softly or reciting lines from scripture while performing repetitive kitchen or garden tasks, a detail historians still argue as either genuine pedagogical reinforcement or symbolic gesture. You trudge past stacked baskets of onions, garlic, apples, and root vegetables, imagining the quiet choreography that transformed simple ingredients into meals, medicines, and preserved stores that sustained life through harsh winters and lean seasons. The simplicity of ingredients contrasted with the sophistication of methods. You probably won't survive picturing the layering of flavors in stews, the balancing of herbs in teas, and the careful timing of breads rising in stone ovens without appreciating the understated creativity and experimentation monks applied within austere constraints. Historians still debate whether monasteries were centers of culinary innovation or merely practical hubs of survival and moderation. By the time you pause in the courtyard, evening descending softly around you, it's clear that the entire monastic approach to food, from garden to cellar, from kitchen to refectory, is a testament to discipline, mindfulness, and resourcefulness. You probably won't survive imagining centuries of deliberate, quiet labor without a profound respect for the way monks transformed humble, simple ingredients into a life-sustaining, rhythmically harmonious practice. Every root, loaf, and herb represents a convergence of observation, patience, and subtle artistry, quietly whispering lessons about sustainability, restraint, and human ingenuity in the most understated of forms. The sun has finally dipped below the horizon, and the monastery courtyard now hums with a soft, almost imperceptible rhythm. The rustle of leaves, the distant drip of water from stone gutters, the gentle settling of dust on worn pathways. You can feel your own heartbeat sinking slowly with the ancient cadence of monastic life, the steady, careful pulse of centuries of quiet labor. You probably won't survive imagining how each day, each meal, each tiny, simple act of tending the garden or kneading dough carried a weight of discipline, observation, and mindfulness that shaped lives in ways both practical and profound. Your eyes trace the outlines of the stone buildings, imagining the warmth of the kitchens, the coolness of the cellars, and the serene, almost meditative spaces where monks paused, reflected, and whispered quiet prayers. You probably won't survive picturing the rhythm of their daily routines, from the early morning chores to the evening reflections, without a sense of awe for the deliberate continuity that carried forward knowledge, sustenance, and subtle joy from generation to generation. Even the simplest loaf of bread or handful of herbs becomes, in this quiet reflection, a lesson in patience, care, and respect for the natural world. You notice the soft interplay of shadow and light, the lingering scent of baked bread and drying herbs, the faint hum of a cool evening breeze. It's a gentle reminder that history is not always loud or violent. Sometimes it resides in the small, steady acts that nourish both body and spirit. You probably won't survive thinking about centuries of repetition and attentiveness without feeling a quiet inspiration to integrate even a fraction of that focus, care, and mindfulness into your own life. As your breathing slows and the world outside grows quiet, you imagine the monks' daily rituals fading into soft echoes, their lives interwoven with the simple, enduring foods that sustain them. You probably won't survive letting your mind wander through these scenes without a deep sense of calm, respect, and connection to the continuity of human endeavor, the quiet artistry hidden in the mundane. Now the lights are dim, the air soft with the whisper of the past, and the centuries of monastic care gently dissolve into your own imagination. You feel the rhythm of patience, simplicity, and devotion settling around you like a warm, protective blanket. Remember the smells of the kitchens, the cool of the cellars, the orderly garden beds, the quiet reverence of shared meals. Let them fade gently as you drift, carrying the lessons of quiet discipline, mindfulness, and ingenuity softly into your dreams.